one of the greatest discoveries in American history.
Montana, a place where winter swallows sound and the horizon stretches like a scar across the sky. In 1968, beneath a limestone bluff, a shovel struck something hollow, a sound that did not belong to stone. At first, the workers thought it was an animal, old bison bones maybe. But then they saw it, a shimmer of red in the dust. Not rust, not clay, ochre. As the soil fell away, a child emerged, no taller than a man's forearm, ribs dusted crimson, skull delicate as a bird's shell.
Burial site of two young child and an infant.
Around him lay 125 stone tools, their fluted edges gleaming with Ice Age precision. He had been buried with care, wrapped in hides, anointed in pigment, and laid among the weapons of hunters who chased mammoths across a dying world. He had not been forgotten. He had been honored. That child would come to be known as Anzac I, the only human ever found from the Clovis culture. And within his bones slept a secret older than the tools, older than the myths of migration carved into textbooks. Because when scientists finally unlocked his DNA, they discovered that this tiny infant carried the story of 2 continents and 20,000 years of forgotten history. His blood would not just whisper the past, it would rewrite time itself. The grave lay beneath a wind-carved cliff on the Anzac family ranch near Wilsall, Montana. The year was 1968, a time when archaeology still believed in certainty. The discovery stunned everyone. A child's bones painted in red ochre, surrounded by weapons of remarkable artistry. Fluted Clovis points, scrapers, and blades sculpted from chert and obsidian. Each was perfect, symmetrical, deadly beautiful. To archaeologists, this was the crown jewel of prehistory, proof of the Clovis-First theory, the belief that these toolmakers were the first people to set foot in the Americas. They had crossed the Bering land bridge from Siberia roughly 15,000 years ago, chasing mammoth herds through an ice-free corridor, spreading their culture from coast to coast. But they were wrong. This burial, this child, would dismantle that story piece by piece. Because decades later, when scientists sequenced his genome, they found that his ancestors were not the first to arrive. Others had come before them, thousands of years earlier, from lands that no longer exist. The grave was not just a resting place. It was a message buried in code, waiting for technology to catch up. And when it did, everything changed. Before we uncover what his DNA revealed, make sure you're subscribed to Root and Relic, where every buried bone and forgotten genome becomes a doorway into the deep human past. For nearly a century, North America's prehistory was built on a single elegant lie, the Clovis-First model. It claimed that around 13,000 years ago, a small band of hunters crossed from Siberia into Alaska, spreading southward across an untouched continent. Their signature was unmistakable, the fluted Clovis point, a spearhead so finely crafted that it became the calling card of America's supposed first civilization. To scientists of the 20th century, this was more than theory. It was identity. The first Americans were the Clovis. Everything before them was silence. But then, the silence began to speak. In the 1970s, at Monteverde, Chile, archaeologists uncovered the remains of wooden planks, mastodon meat, and a child's footprint dated to 14,500 years ago. 1,000 years before Clovis tools even appeared. In Buttermilk Creek, Texas, blades buried beneath a solid Clovis layer were dated by optically stimulated luminescence to 15,500 years ago. And in White Sands, New Mexico, a series of fossilized human footprints, preserved in ancient lakebed gypsum, revealed something even more astonishing. Humans had walked there between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, a discovery published in Science 2021. If these sites were correct, people had reached the Americas nearly 8,000 years before the Clovis hunters. The continent was not a blank page waiting to be written on. It was already full of stories. The Clovis weren't pioneers. They were inheritors. Still, the academic world resisted. Old paradigms die hard, and the Clovis-First model had survived generations of challenge. But in a quiet lab, half a century after that Montana burial, a new kind of evidence, smaller than dust, would finally break the spell. It wasn't a spear point. It was DNA, the oldest genome ever found in the Americas. And it would prove, once and for all, that the story of the first Americans began long before Clovis, with a people who crossed ice and ocean, carrying the memory of two worlds in their blood.
Suddenly we realize America is this really vastly old place.
Under the shadow of a limestone bluff, the archaeologists worked with brushes, not shovels. Grain by grain, they revealed what time had hidden. A child no older than 18 months, his bones fragile as frost. Beside him, stone blades rested like sleeping teeth. 125 artifacts, each fluted, symmetrical, and stained the same deep red. That red, ochre, was more than color. It was ritual. Used in burials from Blombos Cave in South Africa over 100,000 years ago, to Sungir in Russia and Pavlov in the Czech Republic, it symbolized blood, life, and rebirth. Whoever buried this child didn't simply lay him to rest. They gave him passage, a painted promise to rejoin the living world beyond death. In that moment, archaeology glimpsed something human beneath the Ice Age. These people were not just hunters. They were storytellers, mourners, and dreamers. The ochre that once ran down the child's ribs was the same pigment our ancestors used to mark cave walls in Africa and Europe. Across 40,000 miles and 40,000 years, the meaning hadn't changed. The Clovis had always been viewed as primitive survivalists, but this grave whispered something else. They remembered their dead. And remembrance is the beginning of civilization. For more than 40 years, the bones lay silent, stored in boxes at Texas A&M University. Scientists studied the tools, the pigments, the soil, everything but the bones themselves. Until the 2010 S, when a revolution in genetics changed what was possible. A new generation of researchers from Texas A&M, Montana State, and the University of Copenhagen decided to try. Among them was the world-renowned geneticist Eske Willerslev. The goal was unthinkable: to read the genome of a child dead for 12,600 years. In a clean room lit like an operating theater, gloved hands ground a fragment of parietal bone to powder. Only 1.1% of what they extracted was human. The rest, dust and microbes. Still, they persisted. They searched for the signature of authenticity: cytosine deamination, the chemical scar that appears when ancient DNA ages and cytosine decays into uracil. The pattern was there: jagged, uneven, unmistakably old. The molecules were genuine. Using next-generation sequencing, they rebuilt over 13,000 fragments, each barely 65 base pairs long, until they formed a nearly complete genome with 14-fold coverage. What emerged was a genetic portrait sharper than anyone had dared hope. The child's mitochondrial DNA traced to haplogroup D4H3A, a maternal line still found among indigenous peoples along the Pacific coast today. His Y chromosome, QL54, diverged from its Siberian ancestor around 16,900 years ago. The same lineage seen in a 24,000-year-old boy from Malta near Lake Baikal. In that instant, continents connected. Asia met America, not through theory, but through blood. The Clovis child was no isolated relic. He was a bridge, proof that Native Americans descended from a blend of ancient North Eurasian and East Asian ancestry. Once sequenced, the genome was compared to populations across the modern and ancient world. Researchers used Outgroup F3 statistics, a mathematical test measuring shared ancestry. The result stunned them. Anzic 1 shared far more genetic drift with peoples thousands of miles south, the Caritiana and Surui of Brazil, the Maya of Mexico, than with the Cree, Ojibwa, or Athabascan peoples of the north. The data made no geographical sense, until a new pattern emerged. Admixture modeling showed that the first Americans had split into two great lineages long before the Clovis era began. One, the Southern Native American branch, SNA, moved rapidly down the Pacific coast, reaching Central and South America. The other, the Northern Native American branch, NNA, lingered longer in the cold isolation of Beringia before pushing south through the continent's interior. Roughly 80% of indigenous peoples today descend from the southern branch, the same line as Anzic 1. The remaining 20% trace to that older northern stream. For the first time, stone tools had turned into family trees. A spear point was no longer just a weapon. It was an ancestral signature. The genome did more than map migration. It revealed kinship. A connection stretching from a frozen hillside in Montana to rainforests 5,000 miles away. If you could trace your DNA back 12,000 years, which path would you follow? The coastal voyagers who followed the sea, or the inland hunters who crossed the ice? Tell me in the comments below. Your answer might reveal which branch of humanity you belong to. Before the Clovis, before the Ochre Child was even imagined, there was a world now swallowed by the sea. A vast plain of wind and ice called Beringia, stretching from Siberia to Alaska, wider than modern France. Here, rivers wound through endless grasslands. Mammoths grazed beside willows. Wolves sang under auroras that never dimmed, and humans waited. For nearly 4,000 years, they were trapped between glacial walls. The great ice sheets sealed the south. The frozen Pacific closed the north. So they stayed, surviving on steppe bison and Arctic hares, fashioning needles from bone, lighting fires with driftwood carried by the wind. This exile became evolution. Geneticists call it the Beringian standstill, a period when our ancestors lingered in isolation, their DNA slowly diverging from the rest of humanity. It was here that ancient North Eurasian and East Asian bloodlines fused, forming the genetic mosaic that would later give rise to all indigenous peoples of the Americas. When the glaciers finally receded around 15,000 years ago, the way south opened at last. Some followed the ice-free corridor east of the Rockies. Others chose the kelp-rich Pacific coast, paddling along shorelines thick with seals and salmon. Their footprints would scatter from Alaska to Chile within millennia. By the time the Clovis shaped their first fluted points, people were already lighting fires in Monteverde, raising children beneath southern stars. The Clovis were not the beginning. They were the echo of a migration born on a continent that no longer exists, a world drowned beneath the Bering Sea. But the age that gave them life soon turned against them. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth shuddered. Within a single generation, global temperatures plunged by up to 10 degrees Celsius. Rain vanished. Glaciers surged south again. It was the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year winter that reshaped the planet. Across North America, ecosystems collapsed. Grasses withered. Rivers froze. The giant mammals that fed the Clovis, mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison, vanished forever. Some scientists blame slow starvation, a domino of ecological collapse. Others suspect something more sudden. In 2007, physicist Richard Firestone proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a comet fragment exploding over the Laurentide ice sheet, igniting continent-wide wildfires. At dozens of Clovis sites, researchers found traces of catastrophe, melt glass, carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, materials forged only under temperatures hotter than volcanoes. Whether by ice or fire, within centuries, the Clovis culture disappeared. The great hunters who once dominated 2 continents left only their tools and their child. Yet extinction was an illusion, because the Clovis bloodline endured, carried forward in those who survived the freeze, reshaped into new peoples, new languages, and new ways of life. The genome of the Montana child proved it. Their story didn't end beneath the glaciers. It flowed onward, quietly, invisibly, in the veins of the living. What do you believe ended the Clovis world? A comet's fire from the heavens, or the slow cruelty of a changing Earth? Tell me your theory in the comments below, because the next chapter isn't about extinction, but return.
One of the greatest discoveries in American history.
When the sequencing was complete, when the analyses were published in Nature in 2014, science stood in awe. But the story was far from over. Because what lay on the lab benches of Copenhagen and Texas A&M wasn't merely data, it was ancestry. And ancestry demands reverence. The genome had shown that the Clovis child was directly related to the living indigenous peoples of the Americas. His blood still flowed in the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Northern Cheyenne, and beyond. So the scientists did something extraordinary. They stopped, and they listened. In June 2014, representatives of those nations gathered beneath the same Montana hillside where he'd been found. The air was cold, the wind sharp with sage. A small wooden box was lowered into the ground, dusted again with ochre, the same pigment that had cradled him 12 millennia before. Songs rose into the sky. Drums echoed against the rock. One elder whispered, "He has come home. His blood never left this land." This reburial marked a turning point, not just for archaeology, but for ethics. The scientists released his raw genetic data publicly, ensuring that indigenous researchers could access and reinterpret it themselves. It was a gesture of trust, a new covenant between discovery and respect. From that day on, ancient DNA would no longer belong solely to science. It would belong to memory. Because every genome is more than a code. It's a story still being told by those whose ancestors never left the soil. The boy beneath the Montana hill has been silent for 12,600 years. Yet through the hum of sequencing machines, through the click of data streaming across laboratory screens, his voice returned. He became the heartbeat of a continent. Every new genome sequenced since seems to echo his. The Spirit Cave mummy of Nevada, 10,600 years old, carries his ancestral signature. The Upward Sun River twins in Alaska, buried 11.5 millennia ago, share his ancient line. Even soil DNA from Yukon sediments and Mexico's Chiquihite Cave dated to more than 26,000 years ago, hints that others walked these lands long before him. Anzac 1 is the thread that binds them, proof that the Clovis child was not an isolated miracle, but a node in a vast genetic web stretching from Siberia's frozen lakes to Brazil's green rivers. His haplogroup D4H3A still flows along the Pacific coast, in faces that watch the same sunsets he never saw. His QL54Y chromosome persists across the plains, through languages older than the pyramids. Roughly 80% of indigenous peoples alive today carry ancestry that traces back to his lineage. The Clovis vanished from their camps, but not from history. They live in pulse and breath. In the rhythm of blood, each discovery adds another verse to the same song, a chorus sung by genomes instead of voices. And as sequencing grows sharper, as computers learn to read time itself, that chorus grows louder, reminding us that the past is not behind us. It is beneath us, within us, unbroken. "12,600 years ago, a mother knelt in ochre dust beneath a Montana sky. Her breath clouded. In the cold, she pressed a stone blade into the earth beside her son, painted his bones red, and whispered to the wind. She thought his journey had ended, but it hadn't. When his grave was opened, his bones spoke again, not in language, but in light. Under microscopes and code, his cells revealed what no myth ever could: that the first Americans were not the first, that humanity had crossed oceans of ice long before we dreamed of history. He was buried as a child. He rose again as a messenger. His genome stitched continents together, tore down the walls of dogma, and proved that blood can remember what memory forgets. The ochre that once marked farewell became a bridge, connecting us to a world before names, before nations, before time itself. So when the wind moves across the Montana plains, carrying dust from the hill where he sleeps, it carries a story older than America, a story written in bone and clay and code. His blood rewrote time, and it still flows. If stories like this move you, if you believe that the past still breathes beneath our feet, subscribe to Root and Relic, where science unearths memory, and every discovery brings the ancient world back to life.